Unemployment, bankruptcy, homelessness, a global economic crisis. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about our global economic recovery? Exploring the impact and seeking solutions, United Nations University presents UNU Conversation Series, The Economic Crisis.
So welcome to this edition of the UNU Conversation Series on the Economic Crisis, organized in connection with the June 2009 UN Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its impact on development. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University. And with us here today, we have Mr. Bougrov, who is on the board of directors of Interos, a major private investment company based in Moscow, Russia. And so, Mr. Bougrov, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
And so, with Mr. Bougrov, we will be talking today about how the current economic and financial crisis has affected Russia's finance industry and investment climate. So, precisely, what has been the impact of the crisis on this industrial and investment climate in Russia?
Well, the impact is obvious because you can see it in the economy of many countries, virtually all over the world. It started as a subprime, smallish crisis in the US market, but then developed into a financial problem and actually led to a recession. So we have a full-blown economic crisis affecting all economies around the globe. Mm-hmm. Russia is not an exception in this case because it, over the last 20 years, it has been efforts have been taken to integrate the country into the world economy, and as a major supply of hydrocarbons in the world, it of course experiences a lot of difficulties because of sluggish demand, declining prices, and the general contraction of economic activity. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there is an optimistic view that crisis for everyone is not a crisis.
Yes.
I think it's more of a joke because crisis has a very profound impact.
So precisely in the field of you are in the field of investment banking. I mean, in concrete terms, I mean, what have been the negative impact of this crisis?
The negative impact was that access to cheap money that we used to have in the previous years, when so much money was chasing projects, that access is no longer available, and the credit has become much more expensive, which is not necessarily bad, frankly speaking, because you should also look at the, as my daughter says, look at the bright side. We have a crisis of overproduction in many areas, and for that to sort of dissolve over time, you would inevitably have to go through a period of recession. It's good when you can manage that process. When it becomes uncontrollable and you have a severe depression or deflation in the economy, that would have a much longer impact.
You just mentioned that, I guess it was in the context of Russia, that you have a crisis of overproduction. So what do you mean exactly?
What I mean exactly is if you look at the financial sector and developments there, there's been a market has been created of financial products, the various derivatives, that is close by some general assessment to 600, what are these numbers, $600 trillion.
Wow.
So if you estimate that the global GDP would be around roughly $65 trillion, so it's 10 times more, and that is totally unsustainable in terms of financial stability of the markets and ability to regulate that.
You are talking about Russia or as a whole?
No, I'm talking globally.
Globally, yes. Yeah.
The Russian market was not so much affected by this derivatives, and but it was affected in terms of, again, access to cheaper financing that many of the Russian companies have been able to get from European and American sources. So once that access, that source is dried up, they found themselves in a situation when there is a contraction in their production, the revenues go down, you have to service your debts, you get your revenues in local currency as services, and say in dollars or in euros, so you get the exchange risk problem here. It creates a tension.
Two questions, one having to do with the global dimension. You just talked about this figure, $600 trillion, and you just said that it is not really manageable, or it is not sustainable on the long run. Why?
Well, actually, it is unsustainable because it's a bubble, and that bubble has been ruptured, and that is why this the initial starting moment may have been the subprime crisis, but it occurred in the circumstance of a huge, gigantic, mega bubble that has been created in the global financial markets. Once that problem has been sort of exposed, everyone started to look at the quality of the portfolios that the banks had, the quality of papers, various derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, for example, and we saw that the whole system has been filled with toxic assets that the banks could not able to cope with.
And do you think that the way this bubble is being handled is the right way? I mean, a lot of people in America are saying, well, in fact, we're just recreating the bubble, we're not really getting to the bottom of the problem, and in the process we're in fact setting ourselves up for more problems down the road. Would you agree with this view or not?
Well, you know, people are asking these questions. How long this crisis would last? You don't know, I don't know. But probably it would stay with us forever, because what would come in the post-crisis period would be a totally different financial and economic map of the world, and the system of regulation and oversight would be changed in a very radical way. That's point number one. And point number two is people ask questions, who is to be blamed for that crisis? They usually point towards bankers. Bankers have their own role in this process, but it's basically very lax macroeconomic policy that existed in, that was pursued in major economies, policy based on neoliberal concept. And the second contributing factor was ineffective regulation, because there is, apart from the banking system, you have a shadow banking system that was not totally regulated at all, plus on top of that, the companies were getting their credit resource just 1/3 through traditional banking system, while the 2/3 of financing they needed was coming through different other financial institutions. And that 2/3 of the real market was outside the scope of proper financial regulation and supervision.
But one must have thought that having all this shadow banking taking place was going to be a source of a problem. All these people who are running these banks are smart people.
Yeah, but you're saying that with the benefit of hindsight.
Yes.
Because were we to talk 3 years ago about that, you'll probably be telling me, well, listen, we're steamrolling ahead. We don't see any problems on the horizon. And many people actually believed that this would continue and continue. And there were not many voices raised that were voices of caution and prudence.
Yes.
Everyone was, it's like a herd instinct.
No, absolutely.
So, it's easy to criticize it today, but the more important thing was to be able to anticipate it and analyze the developments, say, 3 years ago.
Going back to Russia, you said that in a way there was too much access to easy money. And yet the needs of Russia in terms of infrastructure and so on are quite important. So how do you balance these two things? How do you somehow portion access to money in such a way that it is really productive use of money?
Well, the way it's traditionally, we believe that the private sector makes a much more effective use of resource and is able to manage the costs and be very cost effective. The access to easy money from foreign sources was, in a way, a result of fairly expensive credit that exists in the Russian domestic economy because of the rate that the central bank charges, because of the inflation impact. Inflation is still in double digits. So that has led to a situation when some of the big major companies were borrowing imprudently and excessively, again in anticipation of the good times to continue.
Yes.
They were not fit for the crisis period that we have now, and that's why they're selling assets, they're restructuring their debts.
But this easy access to money has taken place basically throughout the 2000s, right?
Basically throughout 2000s, after the economy emerged from the Asian crisis of '97, the Russian default of '98.
So in the 9 good years that Russia has had in terms of access to foreign capital, has it had a positive impact on the development of Russia and
the economy in general? Yes, we had positive growth at the rate of around 6, 7, slightly more than 7.5%, and that continued for almost 7 years. Real wages increased. There was a consumer boom, if you wish, in the country. We had lots of new businesses that have started, small and medium-sized enterprises in particular, which was an area of special attention. So in a way, the country benefited from its exports of oil and gas. To a point that we were concerned about the Dutch disease and so on.
So access to foreign capital has been a source of good things when it comes to Russia. So when we talk about the financial crisis, we tend to forget what this kind of dynamics brought in positive terms in the previous years, because it's also the case for Africa. In a way, we are told in these conversations that access to foreign capital allowed African countries to some extent to really boom and grow and so on.
Access to foreign capital is a good, positive thing. It complements your domestic investments in a big way, brings in better technology in many cases, and also proper corporate governance. So by and large, it makes you part of the global economy. So there's no problem with that.
So, but the question is, how do you, first of all, Russian banks, were they affected by toxic assets? Because it's something which is an issue in Europe, but what about Russia?
Not by toxic assets, actually, because they didn't have those papers in their portfolio. They were mostly affected by general contraction and the problems that the banks had, affected by inability to refinance, and so the Russia-specific issue was the consumer credit and ability of the population to pay, because we expect that the non-payments would be increasing towards the end of this year.
So, but I guess, but the question is, how do you find the right balance between productive access to foreign capital and non-prudential use of foreign capital, and that's where the issue of regulation comes in, I guess.
Well, Alan Greenspan believed that this should be based on self-interest. And purely on professional grounds, in his view, the bankers would not be sort of inflicting damage on themselves by acting recklessly or irresponsibly. That turned out to be a wrong assumption.
A false premise,
and that's why you need to find a proper balance for regulation and supervision of the banking industry. But the balance means that it should not suppress the banking as business. Although, in my view, with the new regulations, that it's sort of a pendulum effect here. the regulation would be tough, money would be expensive, access would be difficult. With that change, banking becomes a sort of a utility, regulated utility business.
What does it mean? I have heard this expression before. What does it mean having banking becoming regulated business?
In the same way as supply of electricity or gas, it's a regulated business in many economies. It's not a high margin business because you actually find it as a service which is socially important. That's why it's regulated, and any imbalances in that particular system may impact large parts of the population. So that's why we make this comparison of the banking with how the utilities are being regulated.
And so, in your view, that would be the way to find this balance as a way to handle the dilemmas in terms of need for
on the national level, there is a need to develop better standards for the performance of the financial industry in general. And internationally, I guess countries would be trying to harmonize their national legislation because there may be a run to the bottom effect where countries would start competing in terms of toughness of or degree of liberalism in their regulations, and that effect has to be avoided, and we need to try to come up with some sort of a global standards that would be universally accepted and then put into practice.
And do you see the banking sector accepting to become part of the utility culture?
There is no other way.
There is no other way
of doing that, because you can go back to that type of banking, that existed in the pre-crisis period.
And yet, Wall Street is quite, reluctant to have regulations being put in place. So, if Wall Street is really very much against it, how do you go about becoming utility business?
You keep pushing.
You keep pushing. So if they don't give up, the question.
But remember, it was not long ago that Sarbanes-Oxley legislation was enacted, and, after the Enron collapse and other things, and there was a powerful lobby that was against that, but finally it has been accepted. It's still recognized as a burden on the business. But at the same time, we believe it's a set of safeguards that may prevent us from a larger collapse.
But when you read about Enron, and I used to live in Texas, as a matter of fact, and when you see the issues which are at the core of the Enron crisis, one has to think that nothing much has been learned from Enron to today in terms of leverage, in terms of all these things. So, if there is such a reluctance from Wall Street to really be regulated, would it make sense to try to contain Wall Street? To push forward a policy of containment?
Well, this is not a goal in itself, to contain Wall Street, to use your expression. It's just for the government and for the society, it's a choice that you have to make. And unfortunately, it's a choice between two evils.
Yes.
So you try to choose a lesser one, or you try to choose, sometimes people say, choose an evil you haven't experienced yet. But there's no other way of doing that, and either the banking lobby or the legislators or anyone else, they would have to follow. Otherwise, we would have a meltdown in the financial sector, and it will be chaos.
And are you optimistic about the possibility of this happening? This kind of way of changing?
Yeah, I am optimistic because again, there are clear views that people have on how this should be managed, what standards should be improved, like say capital adequacy ratio that probably will be corrected in this economy and in some others. But beyond that, there is a larger scope of issues that would have to be studied, reviewed, regulated, that were before were absent on our radar screens. And that goes from the quality of financial products, and someone would have to assess that so that the investors and the consumers would be protected, and it ends up with proper corporate governance.
Yes. And precisely, what is the role that Russia can play in this whole landscape? I mean, is Russia a key player? Is Russian banking a key player? What is their leverage? What is their ability to really make things better?
Russian banking industry is not a global banking industry, obviously, but it does play a serious regional role. And Russia plus the neighboring countries, the banking institutions, they're very tightly connected. So I believe Russia's role would be same as everyone else. It's your national interest because you want to have sound banking in your national industry, but at the same time you have a global responsibility, and that's why you join efforts with others, be that within the Financial Stability Board or G20, United Nations, Bretton Woods institutions, regional arrangements that we have with a number of neighboring countries. So all these instruments are used, and Russia is very active in this field.
And so precisely, what are your views on how Russia is going to be handling for the coming year, for the 2 or 3 coming years, the crisis at home? I mean, what is the way forward for Russia at home?
The way forward is, we have to confront the problem head on. Some people that studied and analyzed the period of the Great Depression in the 30s, they came out with the conclusion that it was too little was done, and it was done too late. So in case of the Russian authorities, the government has a financial stimulus package which is about 12% of the national GDP, which is a very sizable amount of money. The economy, the pre-crisis, was about $1 trillion economy, so it's more than $100 billion. It has not been spent yet, but in full. But the impact of the resolve that the government has in order to overcome the crisis is quite evident, and it affects the behavior of the companies and investors. This is one thing. On the other side, you have to create a system of social protection and a social safety net, if you wish, because what's happening is that you still have inflation, unemployment is on the rise.
What's the level of unemployment in Russia?
There are different figures.
Formal unemployment.
But some of the assessments that I've seen bring it close to 10% of the economically active part of population. This is a serious issue. So
but it's more or less the same figure in America, actually. We're getting better.
In relative terms,
absolutely.
It's about the same same figure as here. But you have to provide opportunities for people to study, retrain, get some new qualification or a profession. And this is a government-sponsored initiative. Works quite well. There's some unemployment benefits. People get assistance in terms of social mobility, where they need to relocate to places where there may be still some demand for labor force. The companies themselves do a lot, but again, this is the most serious and important problem that we have. This is unemployment. I'm less concerned about inflation. Now, inflation is like bad weather. So you can't do anything about it. With unemployment, in fact, a targeted government approach, targeted program may be very effective and would help people to live through this difficult period of crisis development.
So you are in New York partly for this conference organized by the UN. What do you expect from this conference, and what do you think should be an outcome if this conference were going to be viewed as a success? I mean, because very often, that's something which happened with the Asian crisis. The crisis is here, we talk, we're going to change things, and then nothing happens. So why would it be different this time?
Well, I'm here in my capacity as a member of the Commission of Experts to develop proposals on the reform of the international monetary and financial system, the Stiglitz Commission. And the report of the Commission is being used as a sort of a background material for the final document of this conference. And, there are UN optimists and UN skeptics here.
Yes.
Some say that there are more skeptics than optimists.
Yes, it seems so, yes.
But they would say, oh, it's another UN conference. Ministers come, they discuss it, and nothing comes out of that because there is no practical or actionable program, and we live from conference to conference. This time around, there is a more serious chance because this shapes the agenda for United Nations on economic issues, which has not been the case for the last probably 20 years. UN was more active, by the way, in the 70s on the economic issues when United Nations General Assembly approved the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States. There was this whole concept of the new international economic order. The UN Center on Transnational Corporations was working on a code of conduct for transnational corporations, and many other initiatives that we tend to forget now because they were abandoned because of the debt crisis in developing countries in early 80s. So we now have, in a way, a repetition of what has been in the 70s, but from a different angle, different starting point. Crisis is evident to everyone, affects each and every economy. The set of proposals is actionable, it has to be discussed. So basically you need three ingredients for something to happen. You need to feel the need to do that, and crisis has clearly demonstrated that need. You need the will to do that.
Yes.
And all the proper words have been said at different fora, be that G20 or IMF or the United Nations. And now you need political leadership for that to happen. But and this is where I think we still have
a lot of work to do, because in fact I'm told that in terms of participation to the conference, the heavyweight actors are not really at the table.
Yeah, but
so how do we bring
you
them
are working in a fairly difficult environment of 192. So the way to do that is to study, analyze what's going on. This is what the Commission has done, and then try to build a consensus around a number of major initiatives that would jumpstart the process. And as you start moving, you would be adding on additional initiatives, and that's the only way of doing that.
So beyond the Stiglitz Commission, beyond the work that we have done in the past months, beyond the conference, the next step is going to be engineering political support and commitment, right?
I think so.
So how do you go about this? Because very often, it's so difficult to move the countries which you need around the table to really have things happening. So how do you commit them to the process?
Kickstart the process.
Yes.
Yeah, you can only do that through the political resolve that governments and their leaders would have. So there's a lot of work that would have to be done through the capitals, also in specialized institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And that's it. We don't have any other instrumentality that would help us do that. So we have to act quicker or quickly before things would start to get worse. Without inaction is worse than even if we move and would make some mistakes as we go. But inaction is lethal.
Yeah, for instance, I think I saw that France doesn't have a high-level representation at this conference. So, how do you bring key... not that France is necessarily a key actor, but how do you bring,
But the important thing is that France is participating.
Okay.
Okay. The U.S. delegation has said that they're here to listen. When you listen, you hear something.
Yes.
And if you're smart, you learn as well. So I believe that as part of the documentation of this conference, would be the report of the Stiglitz Commission. It's a fairly thick paper, 130-something pages, with lots of things that are suggested, and we're not saying that everything has to be implemented right on the spot. There are many things which have to be discussed, but it's a starting point. It's food for thought. We talk about that. We discuss it at a professional level in various institutions or within some working groups. So bit by bit, better sooner than later, but we believe we'll be able to come up with a plan of action and start working on it. Mind you, it's the Bretton Woods institutions were created, when was that, 1944, 65 years ago? Okay, and we never had a major analysis of how these institutions are functioning, what kind of a system we have. The same with the United Nations, by the way, because the socio-economic part of the United Nations has been developing, and we've created so many institutions that sometimes you get an impression that you have a specialized agency for each and every problem of socio-economic development. And some of them are already outdated, some are overlapping, duplicating, and there was never a result-oriented, the way I see it, a result-oriented effort to revamp the system. Some of the institutions should be closed. Let's face it. But people say this is a non-starter in the UN if you want to close a particular department, organization, agency.
You create another one as a way to try to.
You could go a parallel process and create a competing institution, but this is ineffective.
No, absolutely.
So we have to look at the mandates, replace them with modern mandates that actually reflect the changes in the world economy as we know it now.
So you see it as part of a process. This conference is not really an end point. It's more like a starting point. And trying to really push.
I expect that the train would leave the station and we would have a very long journey. But as we go, we would be able to reform it. The first initial point of kickstarting the process and gaining momentum is the most difficult.
And so the goal is to get the ball rolling and rolling in the right direction. Mr. Bougrov, thank you for your time, thank you for your insights.
Thank you very much.
We were having a conversation with Mr. Andrei Bougrov, who is on the board of directors of Interos, a major private investment company based in Moscow, Russia. And Mr. Bougrov is also a member of the Stiglitz Commission, which has prepared the background material and the policy thinking behind this World Conference on the Economic Crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.